they're the same kind of gifts. And other ones do have non-miraculous equivalents. And I don't know, you may have felt like it was a little bit of a stretch for some of those. I don't know how you got along trying to figure out that, one of the items in the list is workers of miracles. Is that by definition something that's not available today, or is there a version today? I don't necessarily have the answer to that question. But the other thing that we talked about, our needs, human needs, as children of God, don't change over time. The God who doesn't change over time is the one who supplies our needs in every way. So the way that he goes about it might differ, but he's meeting those same needs. And he's doing that. How is the body built up? It's built up by the people who have a place in the body and know the place in the body. They are contributing their function to the body. They're using what they've been given for the body. Well, I hope that by now we are agreed. I hope it is clear that the spiritual gifts are not limited to the first century. That charisma, the gifts of God, is something vastly larger than the brief period of miracles in the first century, and that these gifts are given to us now to be used. Well, you know that 1 Corinthians chapters 12 to 14 are all about the Spirit gifts. That's Paul's great treatise on those gifts. And if you read the whole of those 3 chapters, he's very charitable about it, actually, but Paul is writing to rebuke and correct some abuses that were going on of those gifts. How could it even be that the gifts of the Spirit could be abused, right? It's the power of God. It's the Spirit of God. How can we do that? Well, Paul says right in that context, he says, the spirit of the prophets is subject to the prophets. What does that mean? Well, one thing that it tells me is that when God gives a gift, it's a gift. It's yours now. No, the string, he's not still attached to the strings, pulling the strings on your gift. It's your gift. Just think about what he gave mankind in Genesis 1. The whole planet. Have dominion over that planet. How have we done with that? We have abused the gift of God. And that was happening in Corinth. And maybe more widespread, but what we know about from that letter is that it was happening in Corinth. The gifts were being abused, were being misused. And one of the things that they were doing was arguing and competing with each other over who had the best gift. And how out of place was that? And yet, the apostles, the 12, they argued about who was the greatest, right? They kept arguing about it, even after being rebuked by Jesus. They were arguing about it on the Last Supper. Who's the greatest? Well, if those guys, who I can't possibly ever equal in their following of the Lord Jesus Christ, if they had this problem, it's just not that surprising that a church would have the problem with competing for what the top gift is. So what is the top gift? Let's look at 1 Corinthians. So 1 Corinthians, the tail end of chapter 12, Paul says, verse 31, but earnestly desire the higher gifts. Now that sounds like there's higher gifts, right? Earnestly desire the higher gifts. Then he says, and I will show you a still more excellent way. And he goes into talking about love. And he talks about faith and hope and love. And just 2 minutes ago in conversation, what's the gift of faith? That's in the list. Well, what about hope and love too? Aren't these gifts? I think they probably are. But if we just kind of pull chapter 13 out as an aside, kind of, because I think the end of 12 follows right into chapter 14. So earnestly desire the higher gifts. And then he says in chapter 14, verse 1, pursue love. There's love as a gift, I think. And earnestly desire the spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy. So that sounds, once again, like there's a top gift, and it sounds like it's prophecy. But we looked yesterday at what Matthew 23 has to say about some of the reason for giving gifts of prophecy, so that those prophets would suffer, so that the people who were opposed to God, it would be revealed that they are convicted of being sinful. So prophecy, the top one, kind of sounds like it here. Matthew 23 kind of sounds like that's not so great. Maybe it's to be an apostle. Look at right here in chapter 12, verse 28. And God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, teachers, then miracles, then gifts of healing. Well, there we got it. They're laid out in order, right? Apostles are the top. That's the top gift. Wait a minute. Turn over to chapter 4 and verse 9. For I think that God has exhibited us apostles as last of all, like men sentenced to death, because we've become a spectacle to the world, to angels and to men. And he goes on and talks about all the abuses they're suffering, which sounds an awful lot like Matthew 23. So apostles first, or are they last? He said in the same letter, he says both. So what's going on here? Is the apostle the best or the worst? Is it the top or the bottom? It's the wrong question. It's the wrong question. The right question is, am I using my gift, whatever it is, for the common good? That's the right question. So there's a fairly important, I think, takeaway from this discussion by Paul in 1 Corinthians, and that is that we can actually strive for higher gifts. He exhorts us to do that. We can actually develop what we've been given. Strive for the higher gifts. For example, he says prophesying. And this might not be what we would expect. If it's a gift, how can we strive for it? How does our effort do anything? So, and I think this is something maybe we seldom, if ever, really think about. Striving toward a higher gift. And is it still a gift if we get there by our own effort? Well, I think that what Paul says here is really the same thing that James has to say. Let's go to James chapter 1. James 1 and verse 25. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. So being blessed seems to me is equivalent to being gifted. That's really just two different ways of saying the same thing. It's God's blessing. It's not done by our own action, and yet he talks about persevering and acting or doing, and that is after we are informed by the perfect law of liberty. So we look to the perfect law of liberty, the scriptures we have before us, and we persevere. We do. We don't just absorb out of the book. We do something with it. And that, I think, is what Paul is talking about as well. So it appears to me that we have these clues, we can actually work at modern day, non-miraculous prophecy, for example, which, as we talked about yesterday, is speaking forth the word of God. We look into this law of liberty and we work at becoming better at being prophets. That might make us feel uncomfortable, that language, but I think it's the language that we're given here. Well, there's no apostles, at least right now, right? Hang on. What does an apostle mean? One who is sent, right? We know this. Apostolos is the Greek word, and it means someone who is sent. Let's flip over to Romans chapter 10. And verses 14 and 15. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. They're sent. That's apostello, the cognate noun or verb of apostolos, the noun. So it's the same words, the same, and he's talking about whoever is doing the preaching, they're being sent. They are being apostles. We quote this passage, I think, without embarrassment as applying to us, and I think appropriately, it does apply to us. And if we say it applies to us, that it means we have among us apostles, people that we are sending. And it's preachers, right, is what the job is here that's being talked about. And it's exactly what happened with Saul and Barnabas, were sent by the church in Antioch. So this is really not a strange concept. What does being an apostle mean? What's the job description? Well, fortunately, the original apostles actually tell us. Let's turn over to Acts chapter 6. And this is the issue that had come up where some of the beneficiaries of the welfare from the church felt like they weren't getting treated fairly. And so this bubbled up as a problem within the Jerusalem ecclesia. And so they brought it to the apostles, and in verse 2, And the 12 summoned the full number of the disciples and said, "It is not right that we should give up preaching the word of God to serve tables." Now, it wasn't a matter of them thinking that that was beneath them. Somehow, well, we're the apostles. We don't serve tables. No, that wasn't it. They just recognized that administrative duty was not their gift. Their gift was to do something else. And so they said, well, and they brought everybody together and they said, who here would be good at doing the administration, because clearly it's not happening very well right now. We need to do better. And so what they did was the ecclesia chose the first group of arranging brethren to administer the welfare and take care of the situations in the church, and that was the right answer. And here's Paul's take on it, back in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 again. Verse 16. Oh, I'm in the wrong letter. No wonder it doesn't look right. Do I have it? Yeah, chapter 9, verse 16. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting. For necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. So he says, he's obligated to do that. That's his gift. And that's what the apostles were saying in Acts 6 also. They said, we can't stop preaching to do this other work. This other work's important, but we can't stop doing our work. Well, that was entirely appropriate. While it's true that we have no apostles today that are designated by Jesus, the way the original 12 were, we do have people who are sent, people who have the same job of preaching. And they're sent, they're supported. And sometimes that takes a public kind of role. You think of the workers in the mission field. Sometimes it's much more private. People are preaching to their neighbors and having Bible classes with people like that. That there are some among us who have that particular gift that they are driven to be preachers. And it's wonderful. And we need to be among those who are sending those people, supporting those people in whatever way they need. This does not, by the way, excuse all the rest of us from preaching, right? I think the greatest example is right there in Acts 6. So we have accumulated this group, the 7 ABs that are going to take care of things, and what do we find them actually doing? Preaching, right? We got Stephen out there actually giving his life as Jesus had foretold that some would do. And Philip, how do we distinguish that Philip from the other Philip? He's called Philip the evangelist. He was a preacher, but his first number one gift was to be an administrator. And I have no doubt that he accomplished that very well, but he also was a preacher. So all of us need to be preachers, but there are some who are just driven. That is really their job. Well, this gift of apostleship has some major responsibilities that go with it. We're still in the letters to Corinth, but flip over to the second letter in chapter 10 and verse 8. For even if I boast a little too much of our authority with which the Lord gave us for building you up and not for destroying you, I will not be ashamed. And then over in chapter 13 and verse 10. For this reason I write these things while I'm away from you, that when I come I may not have to be severe in my use of the authority that the Lord has given me for building up and not for tearing down. So this apostleship, he says twice in this letter, was given for building up, not for tearing down. Well, isn't that what all the gifts are for, right? We read the passages. What were the gifts for? They were for building up. They were for that whole list of phrases, doing things for the common good. So this responsibility comes with every gift, but he talks about coming with the gift of apostleship. One thing we need to point out, however, is he talks about the authority he was given. And that really does have to do with the gifts of the first century. We today do not have a level of authority that is anything like what the apostles had, that were given to them by Jesus for establishing the church, what was going on in the first century. We don't have that kind of authority. So it's important as we have this discussion that we do receive gifts, I firmly believe, but they aren't identical to the gifts, the miraculous gifts. We need to distinguish that. So I think our sixth big point for the week is that any sense of competition among us is really out of place. Arguing about who's more gifted, who's got better gifts, who's the greatest, those kinds of things that the Corinthian church fell into, that the 12 apostles fell into. They have no place, and it should not be that we are feeling that something is greater than something else. At the same time, it's not out of line to aspire to the higher gifts, right? We read where it says that. So does that sound like a paradox, like it doesn't work both ways? I think the thing we need to note about that is it's not aspiring to something higher than someone else. It's aspiring to something higher than where I am now. If I assess myself honestly, figure out what I think it might be a gift, then he says, work at it. Strive to get higher. And, I think that's where we can do that. So not higher than the person sitting next to you, but higher than where you were yesterday. And today I work on being higher than that tomorrow. That, I think, is how we aspire. So my contention this week is that you and I are gifted, that we have been given gifts for the common good, and therefore we are gifts. We have been given as gifts to one another. Even though they're not miraculous like they were in the first century. Okay, in theory, how does that work in practicality? I think some examples will help. And I think we do have guidance and examples of people who are gifted but not miraculously. Just before we leave this concept of the not squabbling about the higher gifts, a tremendous quote from Harry Truman, of all people. It's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. And I think if we take that attitude into our use of the gifts we're given, we will not fall into the problem of squabbling about who's the greatest. Who cares who gets the credit? Use your gift for the common good, even if it's quiet and nobody ever notices. It's a tough thing to ask for, but it is what we're asked for. Well, some examples. We've already talked about Bezalel and Aholiab, and all of the craftspeople, by the way, men and women, all of them were gifted. Right in the time when Moses was doing miracles, they were not miraculous. They were just gifted, talented. The point of the gift, obviously, was to be used for the common good, for the good of Israel. So, apply this to ourselves. Can we envision ourselves finding a talent, an ability, something, maybe not at Bezalel level, something lesser perhaps? Our gift is to be used just as theirs was. Can we use whatever gift we have to help our brothers and sisters? We talked about Ezra as well as another example. No miracles. He worked. He put in the work. He devoted himself, set his heart, studied, and became, I think he's a great example of what Paul was talking about, striving for the higher gift. He worked at it, and he got there. He achieved what the gift was intended to be for the common good. So we have examples. We've looked at a couple. We're going to look at a couple more. For instance, the book of Esther. I think the book of Esther is one of the examples in Scripture that is most like our environment today. In the book of Esther, God is not even mentioned, but he's there. He's there throughout, but he's not mentioned by name. And the people in that account have no miracles, no revelations. In fact, they just resemble us. It just seems to me a lot like our situation. Events in our lives don't come labeled, this is the providential work of the Lord, with a little flag on it. We're left to discern that for ourselves, right? I think that was the situation in Esther as well. When we know the full story, as we do, we've read the whole story, and then you think about at the beginning and that big party that Ahasuerus threw, was that maybe being providentially guided? How was it that Haggai was in just the right place to be the coach for Esther to bring her to become the queen? Why couldn't Ahasuerus sleep that night that became the turning point for the whole Jewish people? There's no claim made throughout the book of Esther that God was behind those things. But I think knowing that whole story, we can see the hand of prophecy. Mordecai certainly didn't think that it was just luck. So let's look at that. We'll pick it up in Esther chapter 4. And Haman has issued the decree to destroy all the Jews. And Mordecai has asked Esther to appeal to the emperor. And Esther has replied, if I go in there uninvited, I could die. Pick it up at verse 12 of chapter 4. They told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" I think this is Mordecai recognizing the hand of providence here and saying, "Esther, I love you." He had raised her. But don't you think maybe this is why you're where you are? And she does the right thing. She says, "Okay, if it costs me my life, I'm still going to do the right thing." Can we give ourselves the permission to say, I think I've come to whatever it is for a reason. I think I'm here for a reason. It might involve some risk. Can we put ourselves in those shoes? I think we can. I think we find ourselves in those positions if we have our eyes open to the spiritual work of the Lord in our lives. He does this. He brings people to a situation that He intends for us to then use to advance His agenda, which is saving people, making peace where there is no peace, all of the work of God. Can I sit and do nothing in the face of perhaps being brought to something? That's the big question for us to ask. We're going to have trouble getting through the material today. I can see that right now. But we want to go to Nehemiah. Nehemiah chapter 1. So word has come to Nehemiah about Jerusalem being in ruins, and Brother Bill has been leading us in thinking about this era in Israel's history. And verse 4 of chapter 1, Nehemiah says, "As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days and continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love Him and keep His commandments." And just stop right there and notice that Nehemiah's appeal here to God, what he comes to God with, is based on the character of God. And in fact, he's quoting Deuteronomy 7 and verse 9. And he goes on later to refer to some later promises that are made in Deuteronomy. And he's emulating the prayer of Daniel. What we just read looks an awful lot like Daniel 9:4. Praying for his people. And it just says to me that Nehemiah was familiar with Deuteronomy and the book of Daniel. And his prayer, I think, Nehemiah's prayer here, is a model for us to think about. And that is, his example is, when you approach God with a petition, even though you may be in great need, the basis on which you make your prayer is the character of God, the promises of God. You appeal to Him on that basis. It's not just, oh, we're in so much trouble, we need so much help, we need you. It was like, well, we do. We need that help, but the basis of our appeal is God's character, God's promises. We lay claim to those promises. We ask Him to be merciful as He has said He is merciful. That becomes the basis. Going on, verse 6, where we stopped right in mid-sentence, he says, "Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, that I now pray before you this day, pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of your people Israel, which we have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned." And this is a copy of the prayer of Solomon in 1 Kings 8. And he's invoking the response that God made to that prayer of Solomon, where he said to Solomon, "I've heard your prayer, and if people in their exile, if they turn to me and confess their sins, I will hear their prayer." And that's what Nehemiah is basing this on. Nehemiah had 1 Kings, and he had Daniel, and he had Deuteronomy in his Bible. He had these books. And he had access to them. He studied them, and he was informed by them. I think there's a lot going on here that we can see. So he goes on to confess the sins of this people, once again emulating Daniel. He has another quote from Moses. I just think this is a marvelous example. Let's go down to verse 11. "O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name, and give success to your servant today, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. Now I was cupbearer to the king." We read that and we think, oh, okay, he's some kind of servant and whatever. Cupbearer in these ancient Middle East societies was a very high position. He's the chamberlain. He's the Secretary of State. He's the vizier. He's the number one counselor to the emperor. Yes, he ceremonially has the duty, and he does present the cup to the king. But he is not a servant a faceless servant that, somebody that just brings me my wine. He's somebody that is in the court of the king. And just as an aside, how is it that Jews keep getting in this position, right? Joseph in Egypt, and got Daniel in Babylon, and Mordecai, and now Nehemiah in Persia. Just luck. Move into chapter 2. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine, so he gives it to them, and he said, I had not been sad in his presence. The king said to me, "Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick?" Which is not something he would ever have asked one of his slaves, right? This is somebody he knows, and he can tell something's wrong, and he cares that something is wrong in Nehemiah's life. He said he's afraid. Nehemiah says, "I was very much afraid. I said to the king, 'Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?' The king said to me, 'What are you requesting?' So I prayed to the God in heaven. And I said to the king, 'If it pleases the king, if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you may send me to Judah to rebuild the city.' And verse 6, the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, 'How long will you be gone, and when will you return?' So it pleased the king to send me, and I had given him a time." Spontaneous prayer. And this teaches us, you don't have to be on your knees. You don't have to have your eyes closed and your head bowed to pray. You don't have to be in any particular location. You can pray right in the middle of a conversation. Anytime you can pray to God. I think that's a great example for us. Another little side note, why bother mentioning that the queen is sitting beside him? Who cares? Unless it was Esther. And I haven't checked with Bill. I should do that on the timing, if that's even possible. But perhaps she is the queen mother at this point. And perhaps Mordecai has died and Nehemiah has taken his place in the courtyard. I'm not sure if that's possible. It's just kind of, it puts a different flavor on the narrative if that's what's going on here. Well, as he does here, because we go down at verse 8, the last part of the verse, and the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. And he will keep repeating that phrase a number of times, all through his journey and planning the work with the fellow Jews in Jerusalem and the confrontations with the enemies. All through that, he keeps ascribing the good hand of God upon him. No miracle. But Nehemiah was gifted to be the right person at the right time to do this work. And he recognized that the hand of God was at work providentially in what he was doing. He prayed about it, and he went to work. He looked into the law of liberty, and he persevered, and he became a doer, not just a reader. He saw the situation and acted on it. So can we envision ourselves seeing a need, becoming aware of a need, and praying about it, and thinking about it, and searching the scriptures about it, and saying, here I am, send me. Become a doer who acts. Have we ever felt the good hand of God upon us? I bet we have. There's giving voice to that is entirely appropriate. I feel the good hand of God at work here. Well, I would really like to share some additional examples with you, but we're going to have to do that tomorrow. But you don't get out of homework. So your homework today is discussion groups. So form up your group of 2 or 6 or 20, whatever you want, and discuss the possible ways that the gifts given to us now in this age of providence can be abused or misused or not used. Talk about how, what the pitfalls are. Because if the apostles weren't immune, neither are we. So how might that happen? So we'll carry on tomorrow.